So I'm live. Okay, great, thanks. Morning, everybody. My name is Mike Yash. I'm lead animator at Insomniac Games. Most recently on Spider-Man Miles Morales, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, the animation of Spider-Man Miles Morales. So a little bit about myself. I've been animating in games for 21 years. 11 of those years, I've served as a lead on both gameplay and cinematic teams, working for studios like Treyarch, Naughty Dog, and now I'm here at Insomniac Games. I was thinking about removing this card because I know everybody that's watching this has already played the game, right? And if you can't see my face, this joke is failing badly, so I'm going to move right along. Seriously, though, there are some minor spoilers in this presentation, so be aware of that. So structurally, our team is consisted of 2 cinematic leads, myself and Brian Weiser, with a small but scrappy bunch of cinematic animators. Gameplay had 1 lead, Danny Garnett, and a small handful of gameplay animators. And we had 2 TDs supporting us. At Insomniac, riggers and TDs are part of the animation team. Okay, so what I'm going to go over. Gameplay. How we made him his own Spider-Man. What made our game different from Marvel's Spider-Man PS4 while staying in our universe. I'll go over our cinematic pipeline. I'll present our work from home challenges and how we overcame them, and some other features that I want to know. So the project goal. Back in July of 2016, just after we finished Marvel's Spider-Man, a large portion of that team took on our CINES DLC content, and a small but scrappy team went straight on to Miles. The project goals, we looked at Uncharted Lost Legacy as about the size of the game we wanted to, and logistically were able to make within the time frame given to us, a 4 to 6 hour superhero experience. So who is Miles? Miles is a 16-year-old Brooklynite of Black and Puerto Rican descent, who, like Peter, was bitten by a radioactive spider, giving him superpowers similar to Peter. He is still a beginner superhero, and he has a unique set of abilities that separate him from the other Spider-Man. What makes him different from Peter Parker? Well, for one, he's able to camouflage, which makes him invisible. We found it to be used as both an offensive-defensive strategy in our game. This effect was all rendering in the game. His other unique ability are his Venom powers, which are a bioelectric energy he harnesses. We would need to find several ways to use these. We would find several ways to use these powers in our narrative, but we needed to get them in gameplay as well. So how do we make Miles his own Spider-Man? So the obvious one, narrative. This one's obvious. We're going to tell a different story. But then we have traversal. Now this is our term we use for swinging and web slinging around the city. It's a core pillar to our game. We needed Miles to feel different. In combat, again, we needed something to separate Miles' fighting style from Peter from the previous game. And in terms of the overall game, we added some other features unique to Miles. So traversal. Miles is much younger, and as I mentioned earlier, is relatively new to being a superhero. He's only been swinging around for 6 months in our universe. We needed to sell this throughout gameplay. His inexperience would play a major role in making Miles feel different. To capitalize on his green role as a superhero, we gave Miles a slightly out-of-control feel to his traversal. A little over 100 traversal animations were authored or altered to support this. This includes swinging, flailing through the air, and the way he lands. Tricks. To push on the youthful vibe, we expanded greatly on our trick system. On Marvel's Spider-Man, we had 6 tricks Peter could perform. On Miles, we had over 30. And with all that variety in the tricks, we recognized we needed transitions to and from them all. We had over 120 of these, and 60 more transitions going to and from swing and back into air. With Venom abilities in Miles' arsenal, it only made sense to enhance traversing the city with this heightened ability. This was added later in production after we saw what a boost Venom gave to combat. In total, we had 10 Venom traversal moves that came from multiple states. Venom attacks. Once we started to add these, combat really started to feel like it had its own identity and really added spectacle thanks to our VFX team. We ended up with 15 of these attacks, including the Venom finishers. On finishers, including boss fights, we had over 20 unique finishers, all with multiple camera setups to account for collision in game and to keep them feeling fresh throughout your playthrough. We joked about doing this finisher with Spider-Man, the Bodega Cat, for many months, and we finally got it in. It turned out to be a fan favorite, and we really provided a little boost to the entire development team when we first saw it. Cinematics pipeline. The Miles project presented an entirely new challenges from our previous web-slinging adventure. At Insomniac, specifically Marvel's Spider-Man, we took scenes from script directly to previs, mocap, and all the way to final polish, except for the facial, which was outsourced to Cubic Motion. On Miles, we changed our process to deliver quality cutscenes for 2 reasons. The team wanted to get more involved with the story earlier and collaborate more with the writers. And 2, our cinematic team was not the same size as the previous project, so we knew we would need to find innovative production solutions. So to stay true to the creative vision and keep creative control in-house, we decided to have Insomniac do layout, timing, and cameras on cinematics, and outsource the finaling and the facial, which we feel proved successful. So this is where the cinematics really start. Each of our levels have a beat board. Beats here are represented by one of 7 colors that each represent a different kind of player experience. Cinematics, combat, tactical, traversal, puzzles, experiential, and set piece or boss fights. We classify the set pieces and the boss fights the same because we see them as being very similar, big moments in game. So simultaneously, here we have the story wall for Miles. It's in a very wide lens, but showcases all the story beats, character arcs, and their motivations. Our narrative team collaborates with animation, design, discussing on how we can best tell the story. And the best player experience possible is where our heads are at here. We aren't thinking about scope or schedule at this point. We don't want to limit ourselves. We'll find a way to make it work from here. And now we need to get it off of Post-it notes and deliver a better visual way to convey our story. Story time, as we called it. From the story wall, an outline was created. By now, we've all bounced ideas off each other on individual beats. We are looking at all the scenes through a medium lens now. We have panels drawn up. We cut together animatics with narration that represent the entire game. This was very successful in standing up the whole game narratively, and it allowed us to back out and look through the entire experience through a wide lens. To maintain a complete picture of the overall game throughout production, we had removed portions of the story time as we replaced them with real cinematics and gameplay. Scripts. Writers go to work and get their first draft. What's great about our narrative team is they ensure the story is our story. They invite us in. Creative directors, writers, animation, and design sit down and collaborate, crafting the best possible story to tell through all of our crafts. This is where our lens zooms in on details. We discuss what is happening in the scene, why it is happening, how did the characters change in the scene. We also start talking about scope, and for ways to show multiple actions in readable ways within the same shot for maximum efficiency. In our game, an average page of script equates to about 45 seconds of cinematic. Scripts that fit. So now we're thinking scope. We use duration along with the number of characters and complexity of animation, taking into account how much keyframe is required to scope scenes out. Now animation starts thinking about the shots we're going to use. We don't get too prescriptive here. When we get to the stage, we don't want the actor. We do want the actors to do their thing, but we almost always knew what side of the line the cameras were going to be on when we shot. When we block scenes out, we discuss the types of shots we are thinking about as well. Previs. With our stout and experienced cinematic team, we were able to provide previs for some aspirational and big moments in our game, like our bridge sequence, finale level, and some QTEs. These were areas of the game that would be very expensive for post departments, or the 3-dimensional aspect was required to work the scene out. We're used to prevising everything out on past projects. We did not have the bandwidth to do so on this game. Cinematics are very expensive, so we needed something other than previs to plan the rest of the scenes out in a smart and efficient way. And how? The answer for us were top-downs. These were maps of the space the scene took place in, with arrows pointing where the characters would go. They were important for everyone to understand the blocking of the characters in the scene. Larger, more complicated scenes were often broken up into multiple top-downs for clarity. These also helped the stage crew for setting up the stage to match the level on a per-take basis. As mentioned earlier, we often have to break shots up just to cover the distance characters will travel within the space. Speed, efficiency, and accuracy is paramount at the shoot. It's very expensive, and you only have a limited amount of time to get the performance right. We would start by grabbing geometry from the level and place a motion capture stage template in it, represented in the picture by a checkerboard. This allowed us to see how scenes could physically fit into the space. This would often dictate how we would capture a shot. In many cases, we would also cheat where the actors actually were in the scene if they weren't interacting with something. Basically, we knew we would be trimming shoe leather, and we don't really need to see every step that's taken from one place to another. We would send this geometry to the scene, and the sets would be built to match the geometry. Generally, ropes or large boxes were used for boundaries. And in cases where we had characters interacting with a wall or another piece of geometry that wasn't a movable set piece, we could have more elaborate builds. Regarding the actors, showing them these spaces helped them understand where they were and in turn give them better performances. So shoot prep. A few days prior to the shoot, we all collaborate again, reading through scripts, reviewing the top downs, going through the script line by line. What emotion are our characters feeling on every line delivered? We had to be sure we were all on the same page. It's at this time we would break down scenes on how they would be shot. This could be because of length, number of lines delivered, how much space is covering the shot. Our stage is 14 meters square, and we all know in video games, worlds are generally much larger than in the real world. Another reason we would break it up, we would often shoot stunt actors at the same time as our performance actors, and this required some space. When we did this, they would stand behind the performance actors and mime what they were doing to match cadence of the actors. Shoot day. The cinematic team sits down, grabs a cup of coffee or three, and schedules out the day based on complexity of scenes, script length, the types of actions. Do we need to get stunt versions? We also need to take into account times for each. Some complicated sets can take 3 people on the stage crew 30 minutes to build. Every second counts. Excuse me. Really, much of this is figured out the day before the shoot, but writing out a time to stick to for each scene helps keeps us on schedule. For each shot or portion of the scene we shoot, we spell everything out. We have a character list. Do we need stunts? Which stunt person to perform them? Which actors have to have their faces marked up for HMC facial capture? We have the geometry listed to be loaded up quickly and to build to. We have a list of props required, and if we need any cameramen to lock in the characters for video reference throughout the scene. Also, what state are the characters starting and ending in if there is a seamless transition in or out? Action. On Miles' production, our stage crew were represented by animation leads who directed the scene, our creative director, writers, and in the case of our younger actors, a dialogue coach would also help serve as a script coordinator. After the small group of us get together and discussed what worked, what didn't, if anything, how to improve on the next take. It's important to know how to talk to actors on set. Usually not being too prescriptive. They are bringing a lot of talent to the table, so we don't want to infect their performance too much with our interpretation of what we want to see. We often use analogies in trying to steer performances. Something like, remember that time, the first time you got dumped by your girlfriend or boyfriend? Things like that. With stunt actors and gameplay shoots, it's more common to show what you want by acting it out. Stunts are generally, but not always, more dependent on bigger, more physical types of motion, and often require to start and end in particular poses. Our actors are off book, meaning they know the scripts inside and out when they arrive to set, but we would still need to go over the physical blocking of the scene with them. So we do full walkthroughs of the scenes with them. We look to both our performance and stunt actors for suggestions on how to hone in on the performance needed. In most cases, we would rehearse for a bit before shooting. And for about a dozen of the scenes we deemed the most important to the game, we would have a half day of rehearsal the day before the shooting. We usually best their performances as we move down the list, but often watch the video reference after to select the best of the best. Okay, so the shoot's done, mocap and video reference data is delivered. As leads, we kick off scenes to animators, going over any required beats and how the scene will fit into game. Like, we need an establishing shot, or we need to show blank, we need to show enemies to display a threat. This cutscene is volume triggered, so we need to find a way to help motivate the camera cut into the cinematic from gameplay. Now animators attack layout. Our process here is bringing in a simple FBX rig into our scenes of the best of performance from the shoot. They too have the level geometry in their scene. Cameras go in and iteration begins. Our dailies were actually twice a week for feedback to our internal animators. With our cinematics ranging from 10 seconds to 3 minutes, scenes took anywhere from a few days to 5 weeks to get the timing and camera lock. This includes all the keyframe blocking that was required. In our cinematics, we probably had a breakdown of about 65% mocap, and the other 35% was either pure keyframe or very heavily edited mocap. As we approach lock, we transfer the data from the FBX rigs to our character rigs. We usually stay on the FBX rigs for minor performance reasons, but to export it to game, we must get the mocap data onto our real characters in the scene. We usually got a scene working in-game about halfway through the layout process. Lighting, contrast, and color can have some influence over our camera composition and feeling out the transitions in and out of the cinematic can also affect the timing or composition. So we won't lock a scene until it's in-game working as expected. Once we hit lock, our post departments can start their work and we can kick off scenes to outsourcing and for body polish and facial implementation. So outsource. So when we handed off polish to outsource, we kept kickoff notes to a minimum. Most polish work was obvious, so we waited until they delivered a pass and we saw it in game. For efficiency's sake, we had a remote machine for outsource to export their scenes into game. When they are ready for review, a quick quality control check was done to ensure it worked, then it was published. We would then provide feedback through Google Docs, which pumped into a cinematic container JIRA task, which they had access to. Having all the history of all notes for a given scene in one place was very efficient. We could easily refer back to notes if needed. Typically, we would have 2 to 3 rounds of body polish, 2 to 3 rounds of facial polish, usually done in that order. So JIRA. This was our first production using JIRA. So we were starting from the ground up in terms of tracking everything. Our goal is to have all tasks applicable to a cinematic in one place. This allowed communication for anything that applied to the cinematic to be easily accessible for the cinematic issue type. We had all sorts of important info here. Links to the cinematic, links to the Maya scene, links to the script, to game captures, to play blasts. We even have a link to run the game to the objective of where the cinematic took place. The cinematic issue type, in this case, Home to Mom, Miles, and Genki Talk, was the hub of production for scenes. And within the issue lived all other departments' issues or tasks that were applicable to the cinematic. Effects, dialogue, narrative, design, lighting, audio, everyone. We could see the status of each department without diving into it. Additionally, we had subtasks that could go to anyone, where we could request Rigging to give us another control on a prop, or request ADR of a line that wasn't hitting right. Feedback notes for animators and outsource were placed in the comment sections further below. At Insomniac, we're always looking for ways to improve, individually in our crafts, departmentally with workflows and collaboration, and lastly, of course, on the experiences we deliver to gamers. During production, we continually looked at the game. Is it fun? Are mechanics intuitive? Are our character arcs working? Is there harmony between gameplay and narrative? And are they supporting each other? But at some point, we need to say, okay, this is our game, let's finish it. So where were we when we said that? Well, we had a lot to do. Here we have an Excel sheet I've rotated and color-coded to visualize the amount of cinematic work we have in front of us. We had 25 cutscenes in yellow we have yet to start on and needed full motion capture. We have 5 scenes requiring heavy edits, which could be anything from needing new mocap, line changes, camera changes. We have 29 scenes in orange requiring moderate edits. This could be small line changes, perhaps give some love to some cameras to make them stronger. Something like half of the existing scene could work. We had 14 scenes in 10 requiring light edits. These scenes included small camera changes, maybe a line change as long as timing or facial wasn't affected. And we have all the rest in a fresh minty green. They were all camera and timing locked, but still needed to be polished. So that was a lot on cinematics. The gameplay had a lot on their plate as well. In the later half of production, we recognized we needed more spectacle. We decided we needed to up the ante near the start of the game, so we added a boss fight with Rhino. And to support closing our Prowler arc, we added a boss fight with him nearer to the end of the game. For the Rhino boss fight, we already had many assets from the encounter with him later in the game, but many new assets were created to serve this fight with him. And they all benefited both fights. 3 small cutscenes and a QT were also added for support of the Rhino boss encounter. For the Prowler boss fight, we needed to be smart. Much of his moveset was reused and altered from other enemies. We added a few custom melee moves and 2 specific finishers for the Prowler fight. Okay, we all knew it was go time. Let's finish this up. We needed to grow to do this. 73 cinematics were in front of us to finish in the coming months. A huge challenge, but one we knew we were all ready for. We would need to grow to finish this game, so we did, doubling in size, including bringing in 2 more animation leads, and our animation director, Bobby Kotick, stepped in to help us for a time as well to assist in laying out our final push. We also would bring in an additional outsource vendor for polishing scenes after we locked them in-house. We had it all figured out. Then, as we all know, 2020 hit us hard. We had a meeting when all this was starting. I remember talking about it like it was yesterday. What could it look like working from home? I saw a lot of shrugs in the room that afternoon. 2 days later, we were all packing up our workstations and scrambling like the rest of the world on getting everything up and running from home. As we did this, we couldn't help but discuss, how are we going to stay committed to delivering what we had left to do? How are we going to do this from home? That was the question many developers asked. After years of an industry saying it was impossible, we, like many game studios, figured it out. Much credit goes to the Insomnia Games IT department. They were assassins in getting 80% of the team up and running within a week. And from my point of view, the rest of the team was operating at 100% within a few weeks. By the way, this is not the workstation provided by our world-class IT department. So here we are, all set up at home, 73 cutscenes staring us down. Our mocap stage was temporarily closed due to the pandemic, with no opening back up in sight. The PS5 launch date was fast approaching, and our scope was just in budget with the time and resources we had from now, and the clock was ticking. We needed to move, and we knew keyframing all of it was not an option. Too much content to bring to quality that we needed. We reached out all over for solutions. Luckily, we found Beyond, a mocap house in Canada who remained safely open. All of the actors there lived together. They kept the stage crew to one person operating everything. The actors themselves did all the set builds. We believed this was not putting anyone at risk, and we needed to shoot a lot of scenes. This was not ideal, directing over Zoom. It proved difficult. As animators, we often use our bodies when we block out and give feedback to actors. This was very limiting in a Zoom window. With only 2 people building sets to the geo we sent them, shooting was much slower than we were used to. But we were shooting nonetheless. And once data started getting delivered, we could feed a large, hungry team of animators waiting to get going on scenes. At this point, we were quite literally on camera with each other all the time. Scenes were moving along. Our cinematic animators were laying out scenes, and our gameplay animators were polishing boss fights and putting a lot of attention on our player and NPCs. We were meeting with our internal team twice a week to review to get to lock, and we were kicking off and reviewing scenes with OUTSOURCE twice a week as well. This pace we set for ourselves lasted 7 months. As we approached our ship date, our focus shifted from camera and timing lock to polish and then onto facial. The finish was in sight. Like I mentioned earlier, we had our internal cinematic reviews twice a week at the height of production. We could have as many as 20 scenes in production at a time. so these reviews could take hours. We usually invite everyone in to participate in the reviews, but because everyone was so busy, we encouraged the animators to jump into the conference call when we were about to hit their scene and jump out when they were done. We met with our creative director once a week to review the scenes, but with so many scenes in progress at a time, we did struggle for a bit to allow input, but we did find our stride. Another aspect worth mentioning, it's something I kept talking to managers about making sure people were okay. Insomniac made a huge effort in putting people first. As leads, we would meet with our direct reports every 2 weeks, minimally. This wasn't just about work. It was equally checking in to see how people were doing. We've all worked on intense productions before, but this was different. We're doing it from home now. This final push and the work from home situation was a tough combination for many. We really wanted to make sure everyone was okay. By mid-September, we were all but done with some bug fixing. Team members began to roll off. I've never had such a challenging project in my career, and I was so incredibly proud of not just the animation team who did such a great job, but all the Insomniacs for our Herculean effort and providing support for each other when we needed it most. So some other things I wanted to talk about. Representation. Representation was paramount in our game. Not only to support the narrative location of Harlem and to its characters, but also because we need it more in our culture. With our main protagonist being of African American and Puerto Rican descent, I knew what we were doing was special with representation. But honestly, it didn't really even dawn on me until I prepped for this presentation that 7 of our 9 main characters, with any real screen time, were minorities. Many of us at Insomniac were brought to tears when we watched people's reaction to the game and saw how important representation is through something we made. We need more of this, not just in games, but in all facets of life. Insomniac Games is a place where people come first. They recognize how the events of early 2020 shine a spotlight on injustice and equality. So we all felt the responsibility not only to acknowledge what was happening in the world, but to set an example and show support and recognize this as an ongoing issue, not a trend. Something else I wanted to talk about was our character, Haley. Early in production, Mary, one of our writers, came to us and told us she had an idea for a deaf character named Haley. It could be cool if she could, along with Miles, speak ASL, American Sign Language. I was unaware of this being done in a game before, and after looking around, I couldn't find anything, so I had no reference to look at or behind the scenes on how they would have done that. So we had an opportunity to be the first game to showcase ASL as part of our narrative, but also more importantly, to have representation of the deaf community, according to the World Health Organization, which accounts for nearly 5% of the world's population. Markers. So many of us know the quality of the finger data that comes from the stage. On the Sony stage, the typical hand setup will have 2 markers on the back of the hand, one on the pinky, one on the index finger, and one around the thumb. This yields results that typically gets most gameplay and cinematic actions to a spot where the idea is there, but considerable work is still required. We decided we need to get a better initial solve to our characters, so we spoke with the stage about adding more markers for scenes with ASL, and the solution was basically adding an additional marker to each finger. This resulted in us getting more accurate finger animation delivered to us, which really saved us a ton of time. Here's a picture of Natasha Alfili, who played the role of Haley. We still had a steep hill to climb with our 4 cutscenes Haley was in. We had an ASL consultant, Joshua Castile, help us to achieve not just accurate signs, but the timing and subtle inflections for accuracy. As I said, the data saw to the hands is not perfect, so we had Joshua act out all the scenes for us from 2 different angles. This is an early version of we overlaid with video reference for polish. This level of detail to be true to ASL required many sets of iteration. A few lines were even changed, and Haley's timing had to be changed along with some of the hand gestures. So having Josh available to consult was very beneficial. These scenes turned out to be many of our favorite scenes to work on. Personally, they were some of the most challenging for me, and because we've never done anything like this before, we put pressure on ourselves to make sure we delivered accurate, meaningful performances in these scenes. Something else. So a couple years ago, back in 2018, our incredibly talented friends at Sony Animation threw our suit into the Spider-Verse. So we really wanted to return the favor. Similarly to the film, everything was stepped on Miles, except for the top node to allow for a smooth translation and gameplay. And this is the final result. This effect was all post and engine, brought to you by our friendly neighborhood Insomniac Core Engine team. Basically, the keys were run to mimic stepped animation. We got this working across the entire game, except for cutscenes. We knew there were some really big unknowns with the cutscenes. Clipping, when interacting, facial data. We decided to stick with what we had, and we were happy with the results. And these are the super talented people that made the Miles animation team. This includes animations, TDs, and riggers, and our outsource contributors. And there you have it.
Awesome stuff, Mike. Thanks for sharing. Let's go ahead and start taking some questions. I can play moderator while we take questions from the chat. All right, let me first figure out how to go into. There we go. We'll do this so people can see a little bit better. First question. Let me bring this over here so I can see both. Okay. So I know you had the sheet there at the end. How many animators worked on this was the question. I don't know if you want to maybe break down a little bit more on how your team was set up, right? Because you talked about multiple leads, all that stuff.
It changed throughout, like any other production, as things change, and as I think we started out with about 5 cinematic animators and 3 or 4 gameplay animators, and that fluctuated throughout production. And when we hit that go time that I talked about, cinematic-wise, we more than doubled in size. And again, it was never a number that stayed true. It moved around a little bit. And for gameplay, we added, I believe, 2 more people to help the gameplay guys with all the systemic loops.
Okay. Yeah, I remember, I feel like in the first Spider-Man talk that Bobby Coddington had done there for GDC, he also mentioned mission-specific animations teams. Was that something you were afforded, or was that rolled into gameplay?
So on the previous game, we had things broken up in terms of cinematics. We had mission cinematics and we had story cinematics. And the story cinematics were much more narratively driven. It was almost always HMC facial data in that, versus the mission cinematics. They were generally smaller, generally had more action and stunty work in them, and often had much less HMC data. Now, there was definitely overlap with that. On the Miles game, those lines became much more blurred. And mostly the cinematics team took on all cinematics, but the gameplay guys did a lot of like the QTEs. They did a lot of the boss fight transition animations that were smaller size cutscenes.
Okay, so awesome. And I know you had mentioned Cubic Motion was who you worked with for facial. Can you say who your external dev teams were that worked on the other cinematic work, like body and all of that?
Yeah, sure. So, I should say, like, Cubic Motion did more than just facial for us. So, we talked with Cubic earlier on in production, and they wanted to have a go at body polish. So, we gave them the shot, and they did a lot of body polish for us in addition to facial implementation. So, they really stepped up for us there. When it was go time, we brought on another vendor. We brought on Sony VASG to help us finishing scenes.
Awesome. Cool. Next question we got was, were there any challenges in balancing fans' expectations on a Miles game, fresh off of Spider-Verse, while ensuring your version of the character felt true to the team's original vision?
Well, sure. Like, we knew we wanted him to be, he had to be his own person. We had to be true to what the comics were, right? And who he was in the comics. But like I think we are somewhat lucky in the sense with who Miles is and for at least his abilities. Like there's something that's pretty different from what Peter had, right? So Peter has Spidey sense. He's super strong. He can swing, and he's really smart. Miles has these two other unique abilities that really help separate from him, and like they're one of the huge identifying characteristics of who he is, right? As a superhero. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. I think that's great. Next question we had was, what if anything was something that ended up working better than expected, or better than when you were in the office once you started work from home? Is part one to that question.
Wait, so did we find something that worked better from home? Is
Yes.
that what the question was?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, aside from the adjustment that we all had to deal with, like just talking into a small window, we have a sister studio in North Carolina, right? So oftentimes what we would find when we were still working in the office is people would zoom in and trying to get your voice heard in a room with 10 or 15 people that are live, and in some cases loud people, it's hard to get your voice heard. So one thing that really helped us and brought the team together is now we're all on Zoom. So now we're all level in terms of our voices. And I don't mean just volume, I mean just being able to speak. So that was actually a big improvement overall. And I think all the people in North Carolina felt more a part of the team because of it.
Awesome. I wonder too about capture. I know remote capture for a number of teams has now sort of allowed more people to take part in the capture experience because you don't have to be on set and they can. Did you find that was something that you were able to take part of, or did the switch sort of happen late enough that you kept it to a pretty tightly contained team for remote capture?
For the remote capture, there were. It was basically a Zoom call, so like you could have as many people as you wanted to like go there and just kind of be a part of it. Like if there was an animator that knew they were going to be working on a scene that we're capturing, oftentimes they would be in there just to kind of like, because they kind of know the scene intimately of what's going to happen. They may say like, oh hey, like we have to make sure you have to turn to the left at the end here to see this, or that they know things on a granular level. So we would have. In terms of like the people giving the directions, we kept it pretty small.
Yeah.
We don't want everybody kind of just barking out like, "Hey, do this, do that." But oftentimes in those Zoom calls, there were 7 or 8 insomniacs there.
Yeah. To me, that's been one of the biggest benefits, right? Is that instead of trying to download all of the knowledge onto a couple of people to get everything you needed to shoot, being able to pull people in is pretty great. Okay, part 2 to the work from home question that they had was, is there anything that you'll bring back to the office after doing this that you see will improve the work that you're doing when you're back?
I can't speak for what we're going to do as a company because I don't know if we all know yet exactly, but I do like the idea of, as wacky as it sounds, I do like the idea of keeping everything on Zoom when we get together. Even if I'm talking to somebody who some of the people are right next to us, if there's anybody that's not like at location, like we want to make sure that the playing field is level. So if I had to guess, we're probably going to continue doing a lot of Zoom meetings, even if we're in office.
Yeah, I think that's later on in the week. I talk about some work from home stuff from our survey that touches on that. So next question we had. Julie is awesome, and she's removing the questions that we've already asked. Thank you, Julie. Did you run into any resistance from anyone outside the team when it came to, or I guess, marketing, anything that came to incorporating more diverse characters? And if so, how did you convince stakeholders to let you do it?
In terms of like having so many characters that were minorities? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of times you'll see stories where, women don't sell if you make them a main character or any of that. So did you find in your instance that any of those were roadblocks that you ran into as a team?
I saw none. I saw zero. I saw a lot of excitement from all the stakeholders about doing what we were doing. Now they had a lot of thoughts on a lot of things, but like in terms of that specific question, like no, all I saw was excitement from everybody about what we were doing.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah, it was.
Did you make any tweaks to animation with that stepped interpolation once you found that it was implemented? I know you said it was engine team owning a lot of that and bringing that to life. Did you find you have to go back and touch up anything and to work better with it?
No, I don't think anything. No, I don't think we had to touch anything. That was kind of one of our, hey, if we're going to get this working, we have to make sure we're not going back and change the animations, because then we wouldn't want to have two versions of an animation, one for the stepped and one for the regular, because if you change one, it's going to affect both if it's a single asset. So that was one of the stipulations. We have to get this working on a post side so it just works across the board on gameplay animations, and it still looks awesome.
Yeah. Is that, this isn't one of their questions, this is me just wondering. So are you animating on like 30 frames a second, or sort of how is that side of stuff handled?
Yeah, for the Maya stuff, like we're animating and our sample rate is at 30 frames a second. And again, like I couldn't tell you the details of the under the hood of the programmers did, but they basically just mimicked like sort of Maya's stepped animation as if it was on like 15s, so 2s.
Okay, that's awesome. Cool. Did you run into any challenges when getting the ASL animations to read clearly and also fluently, rather than looking like someone that was sort of new to signing?
Well, sure. Like we had some issues where I remember when we first started getting it in, like we had to make sure that the color of her shirt wasn't interfering or distracting from the hands. So we had to make sure that there was a big difference in contrast, so for readability reasons, right? So that was one thing we had to make sure we had. In terms of, so like the actress that we had on the stage, like she was a very fluent ASL signer, like she was deaf, so she was able to deliver great performances. But like we know with a lot of the data, like there's a lot of cleanup that's involved. And then, like I said earlier, like there were even a couple lines that were changed. Not a lot, just a couple of them. So that obviously affected timing and, in some cases, a couple of the signs that needed to be done. But I mean, like with our consultant that we had, Josh, he was great in just making sure we got to that point of where it was absolutely meaningful and believable what we did. So.
Awesome. Was the process that I know you said you would work with him to get him to do different angles? Would you then also sort of send scenes through him after you'd worked on them to say, are these reading clearly?
Yeah, we met. So we did a pass with him, and we got him to sign everything out. We had him like captured in two different angles, and then I kind of did an overlay on top of like the game capture when we sent them to outsource, and I timed it out about to where the signs need to hit. And then we did a pass on that. We got it to like where we thought we were just about done. And then we had another meeting with him and we talked to him. And there were a couple of really small adjustments that we did after that in terms of, so we had one part of the scene where we got to a point where we were close to being done. And we're like, oh, wait a second. She's starting to actually respond before he's done talking. Oh my gosh, the sky is falling. Is that bad? And he said, absolutely. This is a natural thing that happens in ASL. So, we kind of got it right because we kind of went slow and steady with it. So
that's awesome. Next question is, does the Spider-Man engine, is that the same one that's shared with Ratchet? So is there sort of a shared Insomniac engine? And then if so, how does that work with building anim tools and tech across multiple projects?
Yeah, so our engine is called Luna. And yeah, like Ratchet tools. I mean, Ratchet has its own project needs, and Spider-Man franchise has its own project needs, right? Most of the tools that we create with the intention of everything overlapping, right? Because we don't want to have custom things on a project that don't help out everybody. So almost everything that gets created from the animation side, there's overlap between the two.
That's awesome. Okay. How did you change Miles' gameplay animation to make sure he felt different than Peter Spider-Man? So I know you were talking about, oh, you've got the addition of Venom powers and things of that
Yeah.
nature. How much did you find you were sort of able to start with some of the shared stuff that worked from the previous game and amp it up versus total redo?
Well, so I need to mention these guys: James Ham, Andrew Garber, Doosan, uh, Bula. Those guys stepped in, and Chris Lally towards the end. Those guys stepped in and said, like, okay, how do we make him feel more energetic? How do we make him feel more youthful? And how do we make him look inexperienced? So the obvious thing was, and we saw it in Into the Spider-Verse, a lot of flailing around. So that was one of the first things I think they attacked, and it really just changing a couple animations in the swings or in traversal really started changing. Like, this is the direction we want to go in for sure. So like they adjusted lands, they adjusted just the flailing through the air, the swings, the web zipping, um, and like yeah, like there were a lot of assets that were altered for that. I don't know the exact number, but yeah, it was a lot of work for those guys to do.
Yeah, no, it looks like there's a lot of really amazing stuff in there. Um, were there? I know you talked about obviously a lot of bespoke transitions that needed to be happening. Were there any places where you found procedural animation systems were able to be used to help lessen some of that load?
What do you mean specifically by procedural?
So I guess maybe looking at some amount of procedural maybe on the character or things along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, they did do some of that stuff, but like specifically on like a lot of the NPC or combat and like NPC locomotion, like I mentioned, Andrew and Deuce and those guys and Bula, they put a ton of time into taking existing animations and completely changing them. Like, I can't say how, I can't really talk about. They did so much work on changing all existing animations. Originally, the plan was is let's reuse as much stuff as possible, right? But those guys recognized that wouldn't deliver what we were trying to make, and they took it upon themselves to change so many animations on the NPC side to give them their own identity. Or, you know,
Awesome. So this seems like this is someone that knows your resume. So you're coming from Treyarch on previous Spider-Man. You worked on Spider-Man 3 at Treyarch, or which Spider-Man games did you work on at Treyarch?
three,
Three.
three, three, three.
Did you bring any learnings from Spider-Man 3 when working on this generation of Spider-Man games, both Spider-Man and now also Miles Morales?
Um, I mean, I almost feel bad saying no. I wasn't there very long. I was there for like 10 months. I mean, I did a bunch of cool, like QTE style things on there. Um, yeah, I kind of feel bad saying no, but I mean, games are completely different now than they were.
Yeah.
That was, I'm going to date myself a little. That was like 14 years before I got to Insomniac, so something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a while ago. I think maybe more. I know we did a flashback on Spider-Man 2, and you're like, wow, that's still so up. And there's some interesting stuff there, but I'm
Yeah,
sure now it's just like, oh yeah, think of all the advancements that you have now that you can really
sure,
dig into
sure.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not to take away from that game. It's just like games are so much different than they are than they were then.
Yeah. Well, and 10 months working on a specific thing is hard to necessarily extrapolate out. So I don't think anyone's gonna from the team hunt you down. Uh, what was your process, or how did you make the slow mo scenes? Was that in engine? Is that something that you do on like the Maya side?
So we have a tool inside of our cinematic editor that we have where we assemble all the assets that go into a cinematic editor. And we have something that we call, it's basically like an event that we put on it, and we can keyframe. It's called a rate track. So we can change the rate of the entire game, this rate track that we have. That affects, I believe, everything except for audio. I think audio has to be custom for those moments. But everything else gets affected by what's called a rate track on our engine.
Awesome. Uh, what sort of hurdles did you run into when matching animated camera to in-game camera positions during gameplay transitions? And did you have any specific tools or solutions to achieve those seamless results?
So for the first half to 2/3 of production, we really didn't have any tools for it. We were eyeing things up and we were like leaving the blend. We were just trying to match lens. We were going seamless out and getting the camera position as close as possible to where it needs to go and allowing blends to do their thing. Right at the end of production, our engine team was able to get us a tool where we could pull camera data out of engine and paste it into Maya. So we were able to do that on a number of scenes at the end, but moving forward, we're going to be able to be even more seamless than we were. So I'm
That's
excited
awesome.
to do that in the future.
And is that just the camera data, or is it also bringing in like object location, so you can kind of say it's camera data within relation to these characters and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, we can do. Yeah, exactly. We can have the offset between two different camera characters.
That's awesome. Let's see. Going back to the 30 frames per second, but now, did you find there were any issues or adjustments that needed to be made in allowing the 60 frames per second performance mode that happens now with a lot of next-gen games?
I'm unaware of any changes that we needed to do when we moved to 60s. Actually, no. I think there were some issues that we had to move some events around, I believe, and some of the gameplay for some of the combat stuff because like if a hit frame happened on say like an odd frame and now like we're expanding like the impact was softer and not in terms of the animation but maybe like the character reacting to the animation. So I think that they had to like move some things around in there, but I don't believe it was a lot of work, and if it was, I apologize for not knowing that for anyone that had to take on that heavy lift.
Yeah, and that's got to be something too. That's like one of those towards the end of the project things where you're just slamming through, going doing the best you can, and
Sure.
yeah.
Yep.
How many individual animations did you have to make for Spider-Man's locomotion system? So, I guess web slinging and climbing. Obviously, there's a bunch of them. So, I don't know if you sort of have an idea per feature.
I mean, that's a hard question. If I had to, I don't know the exact number for sure. If I had to guess how many animations he had for web slinging around and tricks and all that stuff, I mean, it's easily over 500 for sure. Then when you get into locomotion, I mean, it's many hundreds, if not thousands more. So I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer than that.
No, I think that's kind of the fun part, right? I think there was a certain point where you could look at previous generation of games and go, yeah, I have an idea of
Yeah.
like, and it's gotten to a point now, especially if you've got a single player character, that you just know it's a lot, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, if you take into account all the partials and additives as well, and the layered animations that we had, like it's definitely many thousands of assets.
yeah. Uh, can you speak to sort of what the responsibilities are for animators implementing things in Engine?
Yeah, so like all of our animators put their stuff in the game, like meaning they export, they hook everything up in like for the cinematics, we have a cinematic editor, like I mentioned before, and they have to like make sure it's all looking good in the cinematic. So the cinematic editor is sort of like an on deck circle for getting it actually into game. So once we have it working in our cinematic editor, we can visually see what it's going to look like, the cameras, the framing. In some cases, we can jump in like temporary effects. We have the geometry in there, so we can kind of see like what it's going to look like. And then basically, we give the designer a coordinate, and the designer plugs it into game. So our animators are pretty hands-on, both cinematics and gameplay are pretty hands-on with getting things working in game.
Nice. How much of the I know you're talking about obviously a bunch of transitions and probably a variety of blend spaces and state machines and things hooked up. How much of those are architected by the animator specifically, or is that sort of a specialized group or discipline that sort of does that stuff?
Well, I mean, like the gameplay guys, like they usually sit with design and programming. I mean, it's probably like this at every place. It has been mostly where I've worked. They sit there, they just figure out like what has to be created, and like they just like what we use the term fail fast here. We want to find what doesn't work as fast as possible so we can react, pivot, and move on to what we want to get to, right? So it's just trial by fire. Just keep trying until you get what you want.
Yeah. Yep. Makes sense. Getting towards the end, this might be the last question. Did the standardized facial setup for cinematics and everything carry over from Spider-Man to Miles, or were there any specific improvements that you made to the facial setup for Miles Morales?
We have the same facial rigs for everybody except for 2 characters, and that was just because of logistical reasons. Getting a head rig delivered to us, we had to get it elsewhere. So, for the most part, all the head stuff was the same.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in. I just have to say personally, like, Miles Morales for me was like a high point of last year and maybe of games, of infusing the amount of personality into the core locomotion set in a way that I don't think we've seen in quite a few generations, maybe to the degree that you all delivered it. So I know I looked at it and was like, that's it, right? It's not even just about how do we make it move, but it's what are we trying to portray with the character, and that's what this is all about. So excellent work to you and the team.
Thanks, man. Yeah, the team really killed it on this game. I'm really proud of everybody.
Yeah. Anything else you want to talk about? We got a minute or so left. Otherwise, we've got where people can find you to ask more questions. Thank you for taking the time. I know this isn't a...
I don't know. I mean, if anybody else has any like specific questions, like feel free to DM me on Twitter. I'll answer what I'm able to answer. I don't know. That's all I got for everybody today. Hope
Awesome.
everybody enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, it was great. Thank you for also starting out the stream isn't easy. Talking to a computer screen without an audience isn't always the most natural thing either. So you did absolutely great.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you. Thanks for putting all this together.
Yeah, we'll be back soon with the Dota 2 Q&A with Dan and Christine.